So, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Thursday. Quick reminder, of course, that tomorrow is Friday quiz day. So, again, for online people, I'll start at 10. Although there's not very many online people in this class, so maybe what we'll do for people who are in class here. Good morning. Would you like to start writing earlier? Would you like to start writing the quiz earlier? Like, normally I start with the online people at 10 and then you in-class people start at 11. But do you want to start writing at maybe like 10:30? Start a little earlier and then you can finish a little earlier? No, because you're here all day anyway. Okay, we'll just start at 11. Never mind. I was just thinking differently. Never mind. Cancel that. So quiz day tomorrow. I'll deal with the online people first at 10, in-class people at 11. Yeah, I'm going to say hi to Aryan, who's here. Good morning. And to Shota. Good morning, Shota. And to Victoria. Good morning, Victoria. Let's go. So yesterday we were watching a little bit of that documentary, and we saw how the Greeks defeated the Persians yet again, right? So the Greeks defeat the Persians the first time they come invading. It's a bit of a fluke. I know we didn't talk about it too much. It's a bit of a fluke. The Athenians kind of get lucky. The Persians are not prepared, and the Greeks beat them. But the second time, the Greeks won't be quite so lucky. They'll have to be prepared and they'll have to strategize. But fortunately, they do, right? We see that Themistocles is a very clever military strategist. He sets a trap for the Persians at Salamis. He sends over someone into the Persian camp to act a little bit and say that the Greeks are panicking and they're all scared and they're going to run away. You can chase them down and destroy them. Xerxes, like a chump, goes for it. No, I'm just kidding. But he does. He believes this Greek guy. The Persians sail in, but unfortunately they're sailing into a trap, right? And the Greeks with their triremes are ready to go. They destroy the Persian fleet, as I say, to the point where I think the Persians have to walk home. Humiliating. And the Greeks have triumphed, right? The Greeks have won. So this is the kind of thing that maybe it would have looked like, although this is a pretty sanitized version of what it would have looked like. I think it would have been quite destructive. I think, there would have been lots of fighting and people getting cut up with swords and things like that. The water probably would have been red with blood. So it would have been a messy battle, right? But the Greeks do ultimately win. And again, the documentary told us that the question that the Greeks kind of asked themselves afterwards was, well, why did we win, right? How is it that we took on the superpower of the ancient world and we beat them not once, but twice? How do we explain that, right? And the idea kind of came about that it was because of their democracy, right? It was because they did things in a different way, right? In Persia, they had kings, right? They had autocrats. They had monarchs. But here in Greece, they were a democracy, right? The power was with the people. The power was with the people. And so that was kind of seen as, that's the difference, right? Democracy triumphs over tyranny. And again, I think that's still an idea that's floating around the Western world, right? I think that here in Canada and the US and in Western Europe, places that are generally democratic, we kind of feel that we are, that democracy will always triumph over dictatorship, right? And there's historical examples where that's happened. I don't know if it will always happen, but I think here in the West we kind of feel that democracy is superior and that it will always win out over dictatorships. But who knows? But anyway, the Greeks start to have this kind of idea. Oh yeah, so now I'd like to show you two quick videos. And part of this is to try to figure out what life would have been like for the average Athenian or for the average Greek, right? So here I have a quick video that talks about a day in the life of ancient Athens. And it's kind of, I was going to say it's cartoony. It's not cartoony, it is animated, but it will kind of give us a bit of an idea of what maybe life in ancient Athens might have been like, at least for some people, okay? So I'll show you this video, and what I'd like you to pay attention to is what do we learn about the lives of Athenian men and Athenian boys? What do we learn about the lives of Athenian women and Athenian girls? What aspects of democracy do we see in this video? And what kind of aspects of social life do we see? Okay? It's a short video, but there's a lot to talk about. So, for online people, the link here and the questions are in Microsoft Teams. We're going to watch it and then we'll come right back and talk about it, okay? So, online people, we'll see you in just a minute or two. So, what are some of the things we hear about the lives of Athenian men and boys? What do we see?
What? About mine is like those who already finished their military service.
Okay, so what was it about finishing military training? What did that allow you to do?
Join the Philippines or something.
Yeah, it allowed you to join the assembly, right? So the assembly is the people, the body of people who vote on matters in Athens, right? And so you have to be a male, you have to be an Athenian citizen, so both of your parents need to be Athenians, and you need to have completed your military training, right? That allows you to participate in the political affairs of the city, right? And so we meet Archaeus and his wife Dexilea, right? So what does Archaeus do?
He is one of those who participate in the assembly.
He's what?
Those who participate in the assembly.
I can't hear
The
you.
one who participated.
Yeah, right. He was participating in the democracy, right? He was a painter of fine pots, right? What do we see about his life and the life of his son? What things do we see?
He has one son, two daughters.
He what?
He has one son and two daughters.
Yeah, he has a son and two daughters, right? What else do we see about his life? Or about the lives of men?
He's quite wealthy.
He's quite wealthy? Yeah, I think he's okay. He's comfortable, right? Because
Painter.
yep, he's a painter. We see that. Good.
I saw that his son, but the only one was taught Portuguese, right?
It- his son was the only one that was.
Taught to read and write.
Yeah, right. So his son was kind of getting a more formal education, right? Learning to read, learning to write. His daughters, Archaeus's daughters, were kind of learning domestic skills, right? How to cook, how to take care of children, how to look after the house, right? What else do we see, maybe, with regard to men and women and their kind of different roles? What else do we see here?
Women cannot take part on the democracy stuff. And like after they got enough age, they will send to marriage.
Right? So women are not part of the political process, right? They're not at the assembly. They're not on the pnyx. Of course, they have opinions, right? So Dexilea tells her husband what she thinks, but she doesn't really have a role in the political process of Athens. We also hear about marriage, right? That women require a dowry to be given to the husband's family, right? And so Archaeus will have to come up with sums of money to.
So if they don't have a dowry, they cannot marry their daughter?
Maybe if they can find someone whose family doesn't want a dowry or doesn't need one. But I mean, any good family is going to want a good dowry. And so if he can't provide a good dowry, then, either it's going to be difficult for him to marry his daughters off, or they'll have to marry some kind of not great guy, or a guy from a not great family, right? Yeah, so like women's kind of sphere or role is definitely within the house, right? Dexilea is at home all day with the kids. Of course, they have a slave woman, right, who's there to cook and clean and help out. But Dexilea is at home kind of all day in the home area. It's Archaeus who goes out and works and also participates in public life, right? The political and the public life. What parts of Athenian democracy do we see? What?
Like what? What else?
Yeah, how do we see the democratic process unfolding here?
They do voting on the minutes, like at first, like someone agree and no and disagree, and like they continue it the next day and stuff to find the perfect solution.
Right. So we see a meeting of the assembly on the Pnyx, right? We see an agenda with one topic. What do we do with the people of Mytilene who revolted against our leadership? What do we do? There's orators that debate back and forth. There's a vote, right? And what's the first vote for?
Kill those who innocent as well.
Kill who?
The innocent one as well.
Well, yeah, they're going to kill the men, and they're going to enslave the women and children. Remember? That's the first.
And like the one disagree with that because she said it's too cruel.
Yep.
And like the Archaea said his wife's opinion to the other. And then later at night, someone, I think I forgot his name, said like they have another meeting that they finish.
Yeah. So people kind of rethink. They go home, they talk to their wives, they sleep on it, and they're like, maybe we were too harsh, right? Maybe killing all the men and enslaving their women and children, maybe that's a little harsh. Maybe we'll just execute the leaders of the revolt, right? So they have another vote, it passes, and then of course you see they have to send out another, small army to catch the first guys and say, no, don't do that. We changed our mind. Hopefully they get there in time. It's kind of interesting. It may also, I don't know if this would interest you, but Columbia College is also a democracy. No, I'm serious, it is. Because the college is, technically we're a charity, okay? And the charity is run by a society, okay? So the society is a legally constructed thing. So nobody really owns this college. So we don't have, some rich guy in the Caymans who owns the college and, makes money off it. Kind of nobody really owns this college. There are people who run it, and the people who run it are the members of the society, like me. And so when we choose to do something, like for instance, we built this building maybe 8 or 9 years ago, and that was a vote. We had a big meeting. Everybody, just like here in ancient Greece, people got to speak in favor or in opposition, and we voted. And we voted to build a new building, and we built it. And we vote on all kinds of other things as well. So, it's interesting when I see this kind of thing happening in ancient Athens. The same thing happens today in, governments around the world, but also in places like this where we are actually a democracy and we make choices democratically. We vote for things at meetings just like this. Usually we don't vote to execute anyone. Sometimes, but what kind of aspects of social life do we see?
Like what?
Well, that's what I'm asking you. Like what? People getting together, connecting,
Wait, all of them are shared in life with family with each other.
right? So we see a little bit of,
Because they live like in groups and in a small area, and all of them knows each other very well.
yeah, it's true, right? People would have known each other, right? They would have known other families and neighbors, and certainly we see families connecting, right, with Archaeus and Dexilea and their family. What does Archaeus go to in the evening?
What?
Yeah, did you remember the fancy word they used for it? It started with an S? No? It was a symposium, right? So the men kind of sit around and eat and drink wine and talk politics and all the other stuff that guys like to talk about, right? So, going out for a beer with the guys, that's kind of what the symposium is thousands of years ago. And of course, that's where they start talking about the meeting. And so, yeah, we see neighbors interacting, we see families interacting, we see Archaeus hanging out with his guy friends at a symposium drinking. By the way, there are no women allowed at the symposium. Symposium is a men's only event. Yeah, okay. Now, you'll remember that I told you that Greek city-states are different, right? So depending on what city-state you live in, you're still part of Greek culture and you know about all the Greek gods and all that, but you could have a very different lifestyle living in one city-state as opposed to living in another. And so I wanted to, yeah, there that is. I wanted to talk about the Spartans, okay? And so, because as we kind of see here, the Athenians are going to go to war with Sparta. We haven't really talked about it very much yet. But again, Sparta is a very different place. And it's kind of a unique place in Greece. It's not very similar to really any other city-states. It's an oligarchy, so it's ruled by a council of ephors that are kind of elected. There's 30 of them. They also have 2 kings in Sparta, which are mostly military commanders, so that when one goes off to war, the other one can stay at home and protect Sparta. They always have 2. And again, they have a society that's really extreme in a lot of ways. And really, Sparta is about turning its citizens into a military machine, okay? That's kind of their main focus. And so in Athens, they're all about profit and business, but also democracy. Later on, they're about empire and power and glory. The Spartans want none of that. Okay, the Spartans are not interested in business. They're not interested in, glory or empire building. They're certainly not interested in democracy or any of that stuff. They are single-mindedly focused on becoming the best soldiers that they possibly can be. And, the sort of mission or the job of every Spartan is to die for Sparta. That's your first priority, is to sort of defend and die for Sparta. To give you an idea of what the Spartans are like, there's this sort of classic story. I don't know if it ever happened, but the Spartans are going off to battle, and the soldiers are, they got their shield and their sword, and they're ready to sort of march out of the city. And a mother comes up to her son who's going off to battle, and she says to him before he leaves, the last thing she says is, "Come back with your shield or on it." Right? So if you come back with your shield, it means that you've won, right? You've been successful. If you come back on your shield, it's because they're carrying your dead body on it. Right? So it's like a stretcher. So the thing was in the ancient world is that if you wanted to run away, so if you were in the middle of battle and you panicked and you wanted to run away, you would usually pitch your shield, right? Because your shield is very heavy and awkward. If you're going to run away, you throw your shield and then you book it, you take off. And so people who came back without their shield, it's like, you ran away, didn't you? Right? So the mother here is saying, come back with your shield or on it. Right? So come back victorious or come back dead. But don't come back without your shield.
So in our culture, we have like something like this. We said that you said come back with your shield, or when you don't have shield, you will come back to our country. This is that when you are going to war, you should win or you should die, not lose.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly, right? So let's have a look then at life in Sparta, right? What were these, as opposed to what we saw in Athens? What's Sparta like? Okay, so I've got some questions here. There are no written records about Sparta. Okay, apparently the first rule of Sparta Club is that you don't talk about Sparta Club. You don't write it down. I don't know. There's no written records, so everything we know about the Spartans comes from outside, right? Comes from other people writing about them. We'll see boys that are educated in the agoge, is what it's called. So this is a school that boys go to. Girls will also be educated in Sparta in a different way. The Diamastogosis, what's that? And then the ultimate, I gave it away. The ultimate duty of Spartan citizens. Okay. So again, online people, the link is in Microsoft Teams. We'll watch it and then we'll come back. I'll see you in a few minutes. So as you can see, same culture, right? Greeks are Greeks, but totally different way of life here in Sparta, right? And again, it's not that far away from Athens, but it's a different world entirely, right? And so we see that there are no written records from Spartans themselves, right? They were forbidden from keeping records about themselves. And so what we know about Sparta comes from people outside, right? People writing about them. How do you think this might affect what we know about them?
Maybe it's not true.
Maybe it's not true. In what way, though?
Maybe those who know that about the thing about Sparta not really know inside about Sparta.
True, right? They might not entirely know what they're writing about, or they might be mistaken on some things. That's true. What else? How else might this affect what we know about them?
There's no they never like live in Sparta, so like they don't really know what
It's true, right? They may not have ever lived in Sparta, so they don't really know for sure. But what would that lead them to do? Like, how would it lead them to portray the Spartans? Why?
they say like Sparta treat the children brutally, like those who they think cannot survive, those who die.
Yeah, that seems pretty harsh and extreme, right? And there's a lot of things about Sparta that seem pretty extreme. Do you think maybe the historians kind of, embellished it a little bit? Maybe made them seem like more extreme than they actually were?
Sir, can I ask a question?
Sure.
Why don't say that the men or the men that die in war or the women who die in childhood? What does it mean? It means that when the girl means birth, they kill the girl.
No, when they die in childbirth, like it's like a complication, a medical complication from the birth.
Oh.
So, yeah. So they accidentally die in the process of giving birth, and
Oh, why just for women? Why?
a number of different things can happen. It's not something that happens too much in the modern world because we
Of course.
we have really good medicine. In the ancient world, it's not super uncommon. It's much more common to have babies die before the age of 2, and it's much more common for women to die in childbirth, right?
Oh, it means that the mom that.
Yeah.
Oh, I think the baby.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, no, it's when the mother dies.
got it.
Yeah. So, yeah, those are the only people who get a tombstone in Sparta are those who died in battle or died in childbirth, right? Again, more.
Instead, anybody or every person that who lives in that period of the time, they don't have tongue. If means they don't have any name or something like that, because when they die, they should put them in the soil and wrote something in the stone that I think the name is Tom. Yes.
Yeah.
It means that they don't have Tom
If
the
they
man didn't. Oh.
Yeah, if they don't die in those 2 ways, no. Unmarked grave.
Very double.
Well, you can see what their purpose is, right? Their purpose is to serve Sparta, right? And those who served Sparta and gave their lives for Sparta, whether it's in battle or in trying to give birth to new Spartans, those are the people that get recognized, right? The other people, they just died before they were able to give their life for Sparta, right? So again, it's a pretty extreme kind of place to live, right? What's the education of boys like?
they gonna be treated partially brutally in school, and like they allow bullying, stealing, and they even they sometimes they don't eat anything
Yeah.
for days.
They're really trying to toughen them up, hey? So not a lot of clothing, so that they, if they're cold, they just have to deal with it. Not a lot of food, they just have to deal with it or steal food, right? They actually encourage bullying, right? If you're not tough enough to stand up to the others, you're not going to be tough enough to defend Sparta. So be tougher, right? So they encourage bullying. They encourage them to steal, right? As long as they're not caught. They were actually allowed to kill sometimes too. So sometimes they'd be allowed to. I think there was certain times of the year when young Spartans could go around and kill peasants who lived around Sparta. They'd actually encourage them to go and do that. Just randomly murder people, just to toughen them up. And to make sure that the people around Sparta were sufficiently frightened of the Spartans. What about the education of girls?
They learn music, dance, writing, reading, even sports.
Yeah.
I think they learn to how to become wives or mothers of Spartan soldiers.
Yeah.
They study to them, and I think I hear that most of the time they educate from home.
I'm not really it's possible. It's possible. Like the girls didn't have an agoge like the boys did. So they may have been schooled at home. But like Felicia mentioned, yeah, they're schooled in a lot of things that, interestingly, democratic Athens didn't teach their girls, right? These girls learn how to read and write, and they learn poetry and music and dance. They learn how to ride horses and do sports, right? All kinds of really active pursuits, right? For the mind and for the body. And again, the Spartans are thinking that strong, healthy women produce strong, healthy Spartan soldiers, right? And so, men are kind of, toughened up, but women are kind of supported as well. And so it's kind of interesting because, Athens is this democratic city-state. This is kind of an autocratic city-state that is purely based on military. But I don't know. I kind of feel like if you were a woman, you'd have a much better life in Sparta as compared to Athens, right? Which is weird. You would think it would be the democracy that is associated with freedom and stuff. But yeah, the Athenian women weren't that free, and the Spartan women were far more free, right? The Athenian women had to cover themselves, right? And they couldn't really leave home without a male escort, right? Their husband or maybe an uncle or something. Spartan women went where they wanted, whenever they wanted. They didn't cover themselves. They kind of moved around freely, right? So interestingly, I think as a woman, you might have had a more enjoyable life in Sparta as opposed to Athens. Yeah, we heard about that Diamastogosis, right? This kind of ritual where boys are like whipped on the altar of Artemis, the goddess of the hunt. Yikes, that's brutal, right? Sometimes to the point of death.
Is it like competition, or it's like a practice?
It's just everything is focused on making these boys as hard as possible, right? So you want soldiers that are, that don't pay attention to pain or weather or anything, right? You want the toughest people to make it through. And again, if these boys die on the altar while they're being whipped, well, I guess they weren't strong enough, right? Sparta needs strong warriors. And if you can't make it through this, you're obviously not strong enough, right? Same with babies, right? They'd look at babies when they were born, and if they didn't look strong enough, off to the mountain, right? They'd leave them out there to die.
And so I think because of like Diamastogosis, and the people yearly sacrifice a human for this like time. It didn't say in the field.
I'm not sure.
But I saw a movie
Okay.
that is like turned back to the Sparta and this period of the time. And after like that period, that like humans that live like Sparta and this, they always sacrifice a human yearly. Not always yearly. They sacrifice a human for like remember that day.
Maybe. I'm not sure. For this kind of Diamastogosis thing, I'm not really sure that it's supposed to be a sacrifice. And I'm not entirely sure that the boys aren't really supposed to die. But if they do, it just shows that they're not strong enough. So I think they're not really supposed to die, but if they do, it's like, oh well, they weren't tough enough. Right? So I'm not sure, but I'd have to do a little more research to be sure.
In that movie, it shows that some of them can't, they can't like continuing because of the like impress that they have, and they die.
Interesting. Interesting. Yeah. So as you can see, like a really different way of living than you would find in Athens, right? The other thing that's worth saying about the Spartans is that they had kind of enslaved the people around them as well. And so in the sort of land area all around Sparta, the Spartans had kind of taken that over. And the farmers who lived there basically had to turn over a big chunk of their harvest to the Spartans. And in return, the Spartans would not murder them much. So the Spartans had kind of enslaved the people around them, called the helots. And so this kind of allowed the Spartans to train full time because they didn't have to work, they didn't have to farm, they didn't have to engage in, business or crafts or anything like that. They were single-mindedly focused on military training, right? And so the people around them were, terrified into providing food for the Spartans all the time. Other Greeks came to Sparta to sort of trade and do business things, but the Spartans were purely focused on military training. And again, it's kind of interesting because I think part of the fact, the Spartans didn't write anything about themselves. And so I think that kind of contributed a little bit to the mystique of them, right? We know things about them, but they also seem very kind of mysterious, right? And very, there's a certain badass quality to them. You have to admit that. But there's also kind of like a mystique to them, or a mysteriousness, and I think it's one that's kind of worked its way into Western culture as well. So even though we look back to Athens for our democracy and philosophy and science and all that, I think that the Spartans have also entered into our cultural memory or cultural mindset. I mean, how many high school teams are called the Spartans? Tons, right? There's tons of Spartan sports teams. My high school were the Trojans, actually, so from Troy rather than Sparta. But still, but even today, I'll just jump ahead. You'll see stuff like this. And has anyone watched this show? No? If you do watch it, there's a lot of similarity. Like, from the kind of Star Wars universe here, Mandalorians are Spartans. They're just in space. And, some of the details have changed. But the way that they kind of, their whole kind of mystique of these Mandalorians, the code that they live by, how other people in this universe see them. They're Spartans. The Mandalorians are Spartans, just in space, if you will. So yeah, we continue to see, evidence of this sort of Greek history and culture woven into Western culture. Even again, right up till today, we see evidence of that. Whew. Okay, you want to take a little break?
Yes.
Me too. Let's take a break, and we'll come back in 10 minutes, okay? Okay, and we are back. So, again, Athens and Sparta, very different places, right? Different ideas about, values and what's most important. Different ideas about men and women and who they are and what kind of purposes and roles they should fulfill in society. And again, there's some extreme, there's some extreme things I think happening in both city-states, right? And again, both city-states I think have been influential to the Western world here. Athens probably in some very obvious ways, but I think Sparta maybe in some less obvious ways, right? We're not a military dictatorship, which is closer to what Sparta was. But again, we've kind of absorbed some of these ideas and, used them in popular culture, sometimes for sports teams, sometimes for our military or maybe for the United States military, and some in kind of popular culture here. And again, if you give this show a watch, you will kind of see Spartans in space is what this group is here. But it's not a bad show. It's pretty simple, like narratively speaking, it's pretty simple. But if you're a Star Wars fan, you probably enjoy it. Anyway, so in terms of the history and the story, we said here that after the Athenians defeat the Persians, they kind of wind up with their own empire, right? They ally themselves with a bunch of other city-states. They agree to form an alliance and protect each other. But over time, it kind of evolves into people just giving Athens money to use their fleet to protect them. And that, of course, makes Athens very rich. But instead of being like head of the alliance, they kind of wind up being head of an empire. And so those contributions that the money people send to Athens to protect them becomes mandatory, right? And it becomes more like tribute rather than, paying into an alliance, right? And so Athens kind of becomes powerful. They have their own little empire. They keep other Greek city-states under their control and under their power. We heard in the documentary yesterday that they basically took over that island of Euboea and kicked all the residents out so that they could get the grain. We heard in the video we saw today that the Athenians were voting on how to deal with people who pushed back against their power in Mytilene, right? And initially they voted to execute all the men and enslave the women and children, right? So again, this doesn't sound much like an ally. This sounds more like an empire, right? And meanwhile, back in Athens is becoming quite wealthy. And Pericles, who we met in the documentary yesterday, he starts using that money that's sort of given to them to protect other city-states, starts using it to beautify Athens, right? So on top of the Acropolis here, acro meaning high and polis meaning city, on top of the Acropolis here in Athens, we see a massive building project meant to house a treasury and buildings and a temple to Athena. And so the biggest building there is the temple to Athena. Athena, of course, is who Athens is named after and who's supposed to protect Athens. This is a $1 billion project. Okay, so in modern numbers, this cost the Greeks $1 billion. Show me a building that costs $1 billion, right? We don't spend that kind of money nowadays on buildings, but here Pericles spends it. As you can see, these are kind of artist renditions of what it might have looked like thousands of years ago. Today, it doesn't quite, another artist's rendition. Today, it doesn't quite look like that. It looks a little more crumbly. Of course, it's been 2,500 years. The Acropolis has survived a number of wars and a few bombings and things like that. So it looks a little rough, but still pretty spectacular, right? 2,500 years later. Inside the temple of Athena, there used to be a statue of Athena standing just like this. This is in a museum somewhere. I don't know where the statue went. The statue disappeared at some point in history. Nobody knows what happened to it. It was probably taken away and chopped up for, materials or whatever. But originally there was a giant statue of Athena inside the temple. And again, Athens is kind of flying high. They've got lots of money, lots of success. There's lots of kind of philosophy and science and literature and things going on in their city. It's a real high point. But as we also mentioned in the documentary yesterday, the Athenians are spending a lot of this time at war with other people, right? And the host of the documentary yesterday said there's really no 2 years that the Athenians don't vote to go to war with somebody. So they're kind of fighting their way through this whole period. And eventually they decide to go to war with Sparta, okay? Now, the reason for this is that Pericles convinces the people, at the Pnyx, at the assembly, he says, you know what? We are the masters of the Aegean. The only city-state that could possibly challenge us is Sparta. And if we can conquer Sparta, we will be the masters of the Aegean. We'll have all the glory, all the power. Athens will be great, blah, 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 blah. And unfortunately, the Athenians vote for it. They decide, okay, we're going to go to war with Sparta. They develop a plan, okay? And the plan is kind of this. The plan is to leave the countryside and hide inside the walls of Athens, right? The thing here is that the Athenians and the Spartans are very poorly matched, okay? The Athenians have the greatest fleet on the water. They have all those triremes that are really fast and can ram other ships. They're really good at maneuvering their triremes. But the problem is the Spartans don't have any boats. The Spartans are not a naval power. They're a land-based power. They're infantry. They're soldiers. And so the Athenians can't really use their fleet against the Spartans, but they'd be fools to march into battle on land against the Spartans because they'll cut them up, right? Similarly, the Spartans are now going to be at war with Athens, but they can't really get at them. They can't attack their ships because they don't have any navy, and the Athenians won't fight them on land. So we kind of have a bit of a mismatch here. The Athenians, what they're going to try to do is hide inside their city, so they'll be protected from the Spartans, sail their fleet around, and kind of go ashore, run up, fight the Spartans really quickly, and then hop back in their boats and sail away. And so they hope they can kind of keep doing this in a number of small, quick battles and then get away quickly so that eventually they wear the Spartans down and they win. That's the plan here anyway. So, how does this go? Well, I have a little bit of reading for you to do to find out, okay? So it's just 2.5 or maybe 3 pages. It's just a short reading that talks about how this Peloponnesian War goes and how long it goes for, who wins, and then how do Athens and Sparta kind of change as a result? Okay, so just a few questions from the textbook. So I'll give you some time to read. Felicia, how much time do we need? How about 13 minutes? 14? Where does that bring us to? Ooh, that's not much time. Okay, 13 and a half. Split the difference. Whoop. All right. I'll let you get reading from the textbook, and then we'll answer these questions. weird. Okay. Okay, people. Time's up. So, very quickly, let's deal with this. Why did this Peloponnesian War go on for so long? 25 years? What's that? Too much conflict? Right, so it kind of it starts inconspicuously, right? So this city of Corcyra kind of kicks off the whole thing. Well, why does it go on for so long? Right. The land? Yeah, these two powers are kind of mismatched, right? They can't really fight each other directly. If they just could have marched out, either on land or used their navies and fought each other and, a decisive battle, then it would have been over, right? The Persians came, they came to Salamis, they got their butts kicked and they went home. End of story, right? It was all over reasonably quickly, right? But here, we can't really have that decisive battle, right? And so they're just kind of attacking each other and running away and trying to sort of dodge each other, and it drags on, right? The war drags on because they can't have a proper battle and have a winner and a loser, right? They're kind of trying to attack the other person and then run away. And so you can never really get that ending, right? That closure. How did Athens and Sparta change as a result? Okay, Athens becomes more democratic. Why?
Increase of need of manpower.
Right. So before, you needed to go through your military training, and to be part of the military, you needed to be able to buy your own armor, right? You needed to be able to supply yourself. And poor people couldn't do that. They couldn't afford armor, and so they couldn't participate. But here, you need these guys to row the boats, right? Every trireme needs a crew of, I don't know, 100 or 120 people. All of those guys want votes, right? They want to have a say. And so Athens becomes even more democratic because they actually have to let these people participate in the politics because they need them to row the boats, right? If they no votes, no boats. How about that? It even rhymes, right? So the Athenians are kind of forced to allow these guys to participate in politics because they need them as rowers, right? So even, even more people are now able to go to the assembly. Even more people can vote. But what about Sparta? Okay. Isolationism? What does that mean? Yeah. So before the Peloponnesian War, Sparta kind of minds its own business, right? Yes, they are fearsome warriors. Yes, you don't want to cross them. But if you leave them alone, they'll leave you alone, right? They're not really too interested in what's going on outside of their own backyard. They don't get involved in other people's conflicts, really. If you stay out of their hair, they'll stay out of yours, right? But here we see Sparta become much more involved in the affairs of the Aegean world, right? They are kind of fighting against Athens. They're trying to defeat them. They're making alliances with other groups. They do get some ships from the Persians, believe it or not, to finish off this war. And so they kind of become much more connected to the Greek world, right? Whereas before the war, yeah, they kind of just minded their own business, right? They weren't really too involved in what other people were doing usually. How does the war come to an end? Yeah. Yeah. So they conclude a peace treaty, but it doesn't last. Right. The Athenians set sail to Syracuse, right, to defend one of their allies and attack a Spartan ally, right? That's a disaster. Apparently, what's that? The general what? Oh yeah. Well, not only that. When the Athenians went to Syracuse, nobody came back, right? So everyone got on the boats. They sailed off to glory or whatever. Nobody came back. And in fact, they found out about it. They found out what happened in the battle from just some random guy who came through Athens like 2 years later. He was getting his hair cut, apparently. And the guy was like, yeah, there was this great battle at Syracuse, and it was a disaster, and all the Athenians were killed. And the Athenians were like, oh, that's what happened, because we sent our army off and nobody ever came back, and nobody ever knew what happened. And so they were destroyed at Syracuse. No one came home from that. But finally, we see the Athenians defeated, right? The general there, Lysander, the Spartan general, Spartan king, I guess, surrounds Athens, cuts off their access to farmland, cuts off their access to the sea with his Persian boats, with his Persian fleet, and Athens is kind of forced to surrender, right? They can't get any food in, they can't get any supplies. It's a stranglehold, right? And so the Athenians are forced to surrender. Lysander tears down Athens' walls, the protective walls around it. He has them all dismantled. He burns their entire fleet to the water. Oof, that must have hurt, right? Can you imagine that? Hundreds and hundreds of your triremes just torched. Oof, awful, right? And then Athens kind of becomes a different kind of city. What kind of city do they become? Yes, but kind of after that. The Spartans kind of rule them for a while until the Athenians can get rid of them, but no, not quite. I'll help you out here because we've got 30 seconds left. But what happens to Athens is that Athens kind of, the character of Athens changes. So they're still democratic, but, pre-Peloponnesian War, they're kind of militaristic and they're building an empire and they're ruling an empire. But after the war, after they lose, after their fleet is burned, they kind of become a city that's more interested in kind of intellectual pursuits, culture, science, philosophy, the arts, like playwriting. They kind of become more of like a cultural hub rather than like an economic and a military hub. Okay, so after their loss, they kind of change and they're a different kind of city, right? Because they've had all of that military glory and their navy kind of taken away from them. And so the character of Athens kind of changes after that. Okay, that's all the time we have. Pack it all up. I will see you tomorrow. Quiz day. Yeah, quiz day.
Presentation is due on Tuesday, right?
On Tuesday, we will start sharp at 10:05. Dun, dun, dun. Okay,
On Monday, you're randomly selected.
Tuesday. We're going to start on Tuesday.
No, I mean that you're randomly selected to.
I'm going to do the random selections as we go.
Oh,
So, yeah. So Tuesday morning, I'll spin the wheel. Somebody will come up. They'll present. They'll finish. I'll spin the wheel again. We'll see who's next.
What will we do after we finish the presentation?
You'll have things to do in order, like while you're watching other people's presentations, you'll have to respond to them, which is part of the.
We don't need to go to the final exam.
What's that?
We don't need to come to the final exam.
No, there is no final exam. Okay, see you tomorrow, guys.